The year was 1885, and the Arizona Territory was a place where danger lived in every shadow. The wide desert stretched out under a burning sun, and the mountains rose up like ancient giants guarding secrets. This was a land of blood and dust, where stories traveled on the wind from one settlement to another. People spoke of warriors, raids, and brave fighters who refused to give up their homeland to anyone. The Apache people had lived here for hundreds of years, hunting in these mountains and crossing these plains long before any white man ever arrived. The Apache were not like other Native American tribes. They were hunters and warriors, strong and skilled in the art of survival. They moved through the desert like ghosts, appearing and disappearing without warning. Every Apache band had its own leader, its own way of living and its own fierce pride. Some bands lived in the mountains of Arizona, while others ranged across New Mexico and deep into Mexico itself. The Chiricahua Apache were known as the most dangerous warriors of all. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, which means they fought using speed, surprise, and knowledge of the land for many years. The white settlers believed something that would later become legend. They said that no white man could survive a meeting with the Apache, especially with their leaders. They told stories around campfires about men who ventured into Apache territory and never returned. Some tales spoke of Apache women warriors who were just as fierce as the men. In the American forts and in the small settlements scattered across Arizona and New Mexico, soldiers and settlers whispered these stories to each other. The Apache, they said, were undefeated warriors who would never surrender their lands without a fight. One name stood above all others in these whispered stories: Geronimo. Geronimo was a Chiricahua Apache warrior, whose name struck fear into the hearts of both soldiers and settlers. He had fought for decades against the Mexican army and the American government. Soldiers chased him across deserts and mountains, but they could never catch him. He knew every hiding place, every waterhole, and every escape route. The Americans called him the greatest Indian warrior of all time. Geronimo had lost family members to violence, and he fought to protect what remained of his people and their way of life. By 1885, he had become a legend, a name whispered with fear and respect across the entire American Southwest. But there was another legend that the settlers did not speak of openly. This legend told of Apache women who were leaders in their own right, not just fighters or wives of warriors. These women were healers, teachers, and sometimes warriors themselves. They guided their people and advised the great chiefs. One such woman was known to be one of the bravest Apache who ever lived. Her story was a story of suffering, escape, and unbreakable strength. The settlers believed in the power of the Apache legend because they had seen what Apache warriors could do. In 1880, Chief Victorio had led a war against both Mexican and American soldiers for 14 months before he was finally killed. After him came Chief Jew, and then came Geronimo's great escapes from the reservation. Each time the Apache would break free and disappear into the mountains, the soldiers would chase them, and the Apache would seem to vanish like smoke. The American government had to send thousands of soldiers to catch just a few hundred Apache. This was what made the legends true. By 1885, the Apache wars had been going on for many years. Soldiers were tired, settlers were scared, and the Apache were growing weaker but not surrendering. The reservation at San Carlos had become a place of unhappiness for the Apache. They wanted their old lands back, their old way of life and their freedom. The government wanted peace, even if that peace had to be forced upon the Apache against their will. It was in this time of fear, war, and legend that something extraordinary would happen. A cowboy would come to the Apache territory, a simple man who would have a meeting that no one believed was possible. He would not be killed and he would not run away. Instead, he would share a tent with an Apache woman, a woman of legendary bravery and strength. This meeting would challenge everything the white settlers believed about survival, honor, and the distance between two worlds at war. The legend said no white man could survive meeting the Apache Queen, but this story would prove the legend was about to change forever. Jack Morrison was not like the other cowboys who drifted through the Arizona territory looking for work and trouble. He was a tall man with weathered skin and quiet eyes that seemed to hold secrets, unlike most of his kind. Jack had spent years learning to respect the land and the people who lived on it. He did not hate the Apache like many white settlers did. He understood that they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. In a time when most men saw only enemies and savages, Jack Morrison saw human beings struggling to survive. Jack had come from Texas, where he worked as a ranch hand for nearly 10 years. He learned to ride horses better than most men, to track animals across impossible terrain, and to survive in the wild places where few people dared to go. He was honest with people, which made him different from many cowboys. He did not drink whiskey until he forgot his own name, and he did not start fights just to pass the time. Other cowboys sometimes made fun of him for being too quiet, too respectful, too careful in his words. But Jack Morrison did not care what they thought. He had his own code of honor, and he lived by it every day. In the spring of 1885, Jack was hired to help drive a large herd of cattle from southern Arizona toward New Mexico. The cattle drive was supposed to be simple work, moving animals from one place to another and getting paid when the job was finished. But the Arizona Territory was never simple. One night, when the cowboys were sleeping near their campfire, bandits attacked the camp. These were not Apache warriors, but Mexican bandits who robbed settlers and travelers for money and supplies. The bandits came without warning, shooting guns and creating chaos in the darkness. Jack was sleeping when the attack happened, and he woke to the sound of gunfire and shouting. He grabbed his rifle and tried to fight, but there were too many bandits and too much confusion in the dark. One of the bandits shot him in the side, and Jack fell to the ground. The wound was not deep enough to kill him, but it was deep enough to hurt and bleed. As his friends scattered and the bandits rode away with some of the cattle, Jack lay on the ground wondering if he would die there alone in the desert. But Jack was a tough man, and tough men do not give up easily. He pulled himself up from the ground, grabbed his horse, and climbed into the saddle even though every movement sent sharp pain through his body. His friends were gone, scattered into the darkness by the bandit attack. Jack was alone now with a bleeding wound, limited supplies, and no clear idea of where he was. He knew he needed to find water and shelter, so he began riding toward the mountains in the distance. For 2 days, Jack rode through the desert, trying to stay alive and find his way to safety. The sun beat down on him with terrible heat, and his wound grew worse as he rode. He drank from his water bottle sparingly, knowing he had to make it last. He knew these lands could kill a man quickly if he was not careful. By the second day, Jack was riding through Apache territory without even knowing it. He was too focused on staying alive to pay attention to the warning signs that experienced travelers knew to look for. The Apache scouts spotted him long before he saw them. These warriors moved through the desert with such skill that a man could pass right through their territory without knowing they were watching. The scouts reported back to their leader about the lone white cowboy riding through their lands. The warriors gathered to decide what to do with this intruder. Some wanted to kill him immediately, believing that all white men were enemies. But others wanted to know more about this man and why he was alone and bleeding in their territory. That night, as Jack made camp near a small waterhole, Apache warriors surrounded him in the darkness. Jack reached for his gun, but the warriors had already aimed their rifles at him. There was nowhere to run and no way to fight for a moment. Jack Morrison looked into the faces of the Apache warriors and believed his life was ending. He had heard all the stories about what happened to white men captured by the Apache. He thought about his family back in Texas and wondered if they would ever know what happened to him. But something unexpected happened next. The Apache warriors did not shoot him instead. They helped him from his horse and took him to their camp. They gave him water and wrapped his wound with plants and medicine that he did not recognize. One of the warriors told him in Spanish to come with them, that they would take him to see their leader. Jack Morrison had expected death, but instead, he found himself walking into the Apache camp and preparing to meet a woman whose courage and strength would change everything he believed about survival and honor. Before Jack Morrison ever arrived at the Apache camp, before he rode through the desert with a bleeding wound, there was a woman whose story was already written in scars and survival. Her name was Huera, which meant light one in Spanish, but her Apache name was Tsegujuni, which meant pretty mouth. She was born around 1847 in the mountains of Arizona, in a time when the Apache still controlled their lands and lived free from the threats that would come later. Her early life was marked by something extraordinary that would shape everything that came after. When Huera was very young, lightning struck during a terrible storm. The lightning killed her mother and her sister instantly, burning them where they stood. But Huera survived among the Apache. A person who survived lightning was believed to have special power and protection from the spirits. Her people looked at her differently after that day. They believed she had been chosen by the forces of nature to do something important in her life. Even as a child, Huerta carried this knowledge with her, understanding that her survival meant she had a purpose she did not yet understand. For many years, Huerta lived a normal life for an Apache woman. She learned to prepare food, to make clothing, to understand the plants and medicines of the desert. She grew strong and brave, and by the time she was a young woman, she had earned the respect of her people. She married, had children, and lived in the camps of her tribe as they moved through Arizona and New Mexico. But in 1880, everything changed forever. That year, the Mexican army attacked the Apache camp at a place called Tres Castillos. Chief Victorio was leading the Apache at that time, and he was one of the greatest warriors the Apache had ever known. But even Victorio could not defeat the Mexican soldiers who came with guns and horses, and the advantage of surprise. During the battle, many Apache warriors were killed, including Chief Victorio himself. The Mexican soldiers captured many Apache women and children, including Huerta. They were taken as prisoners, chained and forced to march south toward Mexico. The Mexican government had a terrible plan for these Apache captives. They sent Huerta and nearly 70 other Apache women and children to Mexico City. Far from their homes and families, Huerta was forced to work as a slave on a large hacienda, or farm, for 4 or 5 long years. During these years, she experienced hardship that would have broken most people. She worked in the fields under the hot sun, did heavy labor, and was treated with cruelty by the people who owned the hacienda. She watched other Apache die from sickness and hard work. She wondered if she would ever see her homeland again. But Huerta was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was not someone who would spend her life as a slave and never fight back. She talked with the other Apache women about escape, about the possibility of returning home. The plan seemed impossible, but impossible things are what brave people attempt one day. Huerta and several other Apache women found the courage to run away from the hacienda. They had almost nothing with them, only one knife and one blanket to share among them all. They began walking north toward Arizona, a journey of over 1,300 miles through dangerous desert and mountains. The journey was almost as terrible as their slavery had been. The women had very little food and very little water. They walked at night to avoid being seen and caught, and they hid during the day. Many days they found no water and no food. Some of the women became so weak they could barely walk, but Huerta encouraged them, told them stories, and helped them believe they could make it home, months into their escape. As the women were traveling through the Chihuahuan desert, a mountain lion attacked them. This was not a small animal, but a huge adult cougar, hungry and fierce. The other women ran in fear, but Huerta stood her ground. She fought the mountain lion with bare hands and the one knife they had. The cougar's claws ripped open her scalp, tearing the skin from her head. The pain was beyond anything a person could imagine, but Huerta did not stop fighting. She drove the knife into the mountain lion's body, again and again, until the animal fell dead. Huerta had won the fight, but she was badly hurt. The other women thought she would die from the wound, but they used thorns and the mountain lion's own body fluids to reattach her scalp to her head. It was a difficult healing process, but Huerta survived. She carried the scars from that fight for the rest of her life. After many more months of walking, Huerta and the other survivors finally reached the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. When she arrived home, she was no longer just another Apache woman. She was Huerta the survivor, Huerta the brave one, the woman who had killed a mountain lion and walked over 1,000 miles to return home. The Apache people welcomed her as a hero. She became an interpreter, helping Apache leaders speak with the government. She became a healer, using her knowledge of medicines and herbs to help sick people. And she became an advisor to great warriors, including Geronimo himself. This was the woman who would meet Jack Morrison when he arrived at the Apache camp, bleeding and defeated, expecting only death. When the Apache warriors brought Jack Morrison into the camp, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and red. Jack was weak from his wound and the long ride through the desert. His shirt was stained with blood, and his eyes were filled with fear. The warriors brought him to a tent in the center of the camp and told him to sit down. Jack sat, wondering if this was where he would die. He looked around at the Apache faces watching him, trying to read if they planned to kill him or keep him alive. A woman entered the tent. She was tall and strong. With a presence that filled the entire space, Jack could see scars on her head, marks that told a story of terrible suffering. When she looked at Jack, Her eyes were clear and intelligent. This was Huera. She moved with the confidence of someone who had survived things that would kill most people. Behind her came two Apache warriors who stood guard at the entrance of the tent. Huera spoke first, and her voice was steady and strong. "I am Huera," she said in Spanish, then repeated it in English. "I speak many languages. The languages of captivity, the languages of escape." Jack understood Spanish better than English was spoken in this camp, so he listened carefully to her words. "The warriors found you riding alone through our territory," Huera continued. "You were bleeding and weak, yet you did not try to run or fight when they surrounded you." Jack nodded slowly. "I knew I could not escape or win a fight," he said in Spanish, his accent thick but understandable. "I thought they would kill me." "Many white men would have tried to fight anyway," Huera said, studying him closely. "Many would have cursed us with their dying words." Speaking of hatred and vengeance, she paused, and her scars seemed to catch the light of the fire that burned outside the tent. "But you did not." Over the next hours, Huera asked Jack many questions, and he answered each one with honesty. She wanted to know where he came from, what he was doing in Apache territory, and whether he worked for the military or the government. Jack told her about Texas, about being a ranch hand, about the bandit attack that had separated him from his crew and forced him to ride through their lands by accident. He told her that he had no love for the soldiers who hunted the Apache. He told her that he understood the Apache were fighting for their homes and their families, just as any people would fight for what was theirs. Huera listened to every word, and she watched his face as he spoke. She had learned to read people during her years of captivity and escape. She knew when someone was lying and when someone was telling the truth. She could see into a person's character by watching how their eyes moved and hearing the tone of their voice. As she listened to Jack Morrison, she began to believe that this cowboy was different from other white men she had encountered. "You have seen many white men?" Jack asked her. "Yes," Huera said, her voice becoming quieter. "I have seen soldiers who wanted to kill us, settlers who hated us without knowing us, and government people who made promises they never kept. I have seen white men who looked at our scars and felt nothing but anger that we were still alive." She touched her own scarred head as she spoke. "But you, Jack Morrison, you look at my scars and I see respect in your eyes, not fear, not hatred." The conversation lasted until late into the night. Huera told Jack about her capture, her escape from slavery in Mexico, and her fight with the mountain lion. Jack listened with admiration growing in his heart. He understood that this woman had experienced suffering beyond anything he could imagine. Yet she had survived and become strong. He realized that her strength was not the strength of weapons and warfare, but the strength of spirit and determination. Before Huera left the tent that night, she did something unexpected. She cleaned Jack's wound properly and wrapped it with Apache medicine made from plants and herbs. Her hands were gentle but strong, and Jack could feel that she knew what she was doing. "I will speak to the warriors and to Geronimo about you," she said. "Your life is not decided yet, but you have made a good beginning." After she left, Jack sat alone in the tent and thought about what had happened. He had expected death, but instead, he had found a conversation with one of the most remarkable women he had ever met. He did not know what would happen next. He did not know if the Apache would kill him or release him or keep him as a prisoner. But for the first time since the bandits attacked his camp, Jack Morrison felt a small spark of hope. Days passed in the Apache camp, and Jack Morrison's wound began to heal. The Apache medicine that Huera had given him was powerful and effective. Each day his strength returned a little more, and the pain became less intense. Huera visited him regularly, bringing food and changing the wrappings on his wound. During these visits, she taught him about Apache ways, Apache beliefs, and the history of her people's struggle against Mexican and American forces. Jack listened to every word, understanding that Huera was deciding whether to trust him completely. Huera told Jack about the treaties that were made and then broken by the government. She explained how the Apache had been pushed from one reservation to another, how their hunting grounds had been taken away, and how soldiers hunted them without mercy. She spoke about the great Apache chiefs like Cochise and Victorio, warriors who had defended their people with everything they had. Jack learned that the Apache were not savages or evil people, but a proud nation of people who were fighting for their survival and their right to exist. One day, Huera brought Jack to meet Geronimo himself. Jack's heart was pounding with fear as he walked toward the great warrior. Geronimo was not as tall as Jack expected, but his presence was powerful and commanding. His dark eyes seemed to look through a person and see their true character. Geronimo had lost his first wife and 3 children to Mexican soldiers many years before, and this tragedy had shaped him into a fighter who would never stop protecting his people. Huera spoke to Geronimo in Apache, explaining who Jack was and how he had come to the camp. She told him about Jack's honesty and his respect for the Apache people. She explained that Jack was different from other white men, that he did not carry hatred in his heart. Geronimo listened carefully, watching Jack's face the entire time. The great warrior asked Jack questions in Spanish, testing him, trying to understand his true character. Jack answered every question with complete honesty. He did not try to say things he thought Geronimo wanted to hear. He told the warrior about his own beliefs, about his respect for people who fought for their freedom, and about his understanding that the Apache were not the enemies the government said they were. Geronimo listened and then nodded slowly. "You will stay here," Geronimo said. "We will see if your words are true or if you are a spy." Over the following weeks, Jack proved himself to the Apache through his actions. Not just his words, he helped with camp tasks without being asked. He carried water, gathered firewood, and helped prepare food. He showed respect for Apache customs and traditions, learning their ways and following their rules. Most importantly, he never tried to escape or betray the location of the camp to the soldiers who were constantly searching for the Apache. The other Apache warriors began to accept him gradually. At first, many of them watched him with suspicion, but as they worked alongside Jack and saw his dedication and honesty, their doubts began to fade. Young Apache warriors started to talk with him, teaching him their language and their ways of fighting and hunting. Jack proved to be a quick learner and a respectful student. Then came the day when Huera made an unprecedented decision. She told Jack that he would be allowed to share her tent and live with her family. This was something that would have been completely unthinkable in normal circumstances. A white man living in an Apache woman's tent, sharing meals and becoming part of her family. In that time and place, this arrangement was shocking and controversial even among the Apache. Geronimo had approved the decision, trusting Huera's judgment. He knew that Huera was one of the wisest women in the camp, and if she believed Jack was trustworthy, then he was worthy of this unusual arrangement. The great warrior himself was learning to accept Jack, understanding that sometimes survival required unusual alliances and trusting people from different worlds. Jack moved his belongings to Huera's tent, a simple structure made of hides and poles inside. He met Huera's children and other family members. Huera's children were cautious at first, but their mother's calm acceptance of Jack helped them understand that this white man was not a threat. Jack treated them with kindness and respect, learning their names and their personalities as the days turned into weeks. Jack's life became intertwined with the life of the Apache camp. He ate with Huera's family, slept in her tent, and participated in the daily activities of the camp. He watched Huera work with other Apache women, preparing food and making clothing. He saw how she was respected as a healer and a teacher. He began to understand the depth of her character and the reason why Geronimo valued her so highly. For the first time in his life, Jack Morrison was experiencing a world completely different from anything he had known. He was no longer just a cowboy passing through the territory. He had become part of a community, part of a family, and part of a struggle that would change his life forever. By May 1885, tensions at the San Carlos Reservation were building like a storm gathering in the desert. The Apache who lived there were becoming more and more unhappy with their lives. They were confined to a small piece of land, far from their traditional hunting grounds and the mountains they loved. The government was making life difficult for them, breaking promises and creating new restrictions. Geronimo and other Apache leaders were becoming convinced that they could no longer live peacefully on the reservation. They believed that freedom in the mountains, even with soldiers chasing them, was better than captivity on the reservation. There was another problem making the situation worse. Some of the Apache men had been making a drink called tiswin, which was made from fermented corn. Tiswin was a traditional Apache beverage, but when men drank too much of it, they became drunk and unpredictable. Some of the Apache at San Carlos were drinking tiswin regularly, and the government was becoming angry about this. The authorities threatened to punish anyone caught making or drinking tiswin. Geronimo feared that the government would use this as an excuse to seize him and execute him for his past raids and escapes. Huera understood what was happening. She could see that the Apache people were at a breaking point, that something was going to happen soon. She knew that Geronimo was planning to escape from the reservation with his warriors and their families. She knew that many Apache were angry and frustrated, and ready to fight back against the government that kept them trapped. Huera realized that this moment would determine the future of her people. On May 15, 1885, tension exploded at San Carlos. A government official named Lieutenant Britton Davis came to the reservation, and he was planning to arrest Geronimo and take him away. Word spread quickly through the camp that the arrest was coming. Apache warriors began to gather, preparing to fight if necessary to protect their leader. The situation was dangerous, with violence threatening to break out at any moment. Huera saw what was happening, and she understood that words might be more powerful than weapons at this moment. She stood up in front of the gathered Apache people. Both men and women, warriors and families. Everyone went quiet because they wanted to hear what this brave woman would say. Huera's scars caught the light as she spoke, reminders of everything she had survived and overcome. "Listen to me," Huera said, her voice strong and clear, carrying to every ear in the camp. "The government is coming for Geronimo, and they want to take him away to be punished." She paused, letting her words sink into the hearts of the Apache people. "But we have a choice to make today, right now." In this moment, Huera continued speaking, her words becoming more passionate. "If you are old women and children, you will stay here and wait to receive your punishment." She spoke these words not with anger, but with challenge and inspiration. If you are warriors, if you are Apache, if you still have the fire of your ancestors burning in your hearts, then you will take the warpath. The Apache people were listening intently, hanging on every word. Huera's speech was not long, but it was powerful. She told them that the Gray Fox, which was their name for General George Crook, a famous soldier who had pursued the Apache for many years, was coming to catch them. "Maybe so you go to Sonora, and he no catch you," Huera said in her careful English. "I have spoken." Those final words, "I have spoken," were like a declaration of war. They meant that Huera had made her choice, and she was calling the Apache people to make their choice too. The speech was not just about running away. It was about reclaiming Apache pride, about refusing to accept captivity and punishment, about choosing freedom even if freedom meant danger. The next day, May 16, 1885, Geronimo, Mangas, and approximately 145 Apache warriors, women, and children bolted from the San Carlos reservation. They rode their horses fast, heading south toward the mountains of Mexico and the Apache stronghold in the Sierra Madre. Huera's words had ignited a fire in their hearts. The soldiers immediately began pursuing them, and soon the government would send 5,000 soldiers to hunt down these 145 Apache. Jack Morrison, who had been living in the camp with Huera and her family, faced an impossible choice at that moment. He could stay behind and try to live at the reservation, pretending to be a normal settler, or he could follow the Apache into the mountains, choosing to be with Huera and Geronimo's people, knowing that soldiers were chasing them, and that his life would become even more dangerous and uncertain. Jack thought about Huera's words, about choosing freedom over captivity, about choosing to fight for what you believed in. He made his decision. He gathered his few belongings, climbed on his horse and rode south with the Apache, leaving behind everything and everyone he had known before. He was no longer just a cowboy who had stumbled into Apache territory. He was now part of the Apache fight for freedom. The Sierra Madre Mountains rose up like ancient guardians protecting the Apache, who fled into their steep canyons and hidden valleys. Jack Morrison rode with Geronimo's band of 145 Apache, moving through terrain that few outsiders had ever seen. The journey south was fast and dangerous, with soldiers pursuing them from behind and uncertainty about survival ahead. Jack learned quickly that riding with the Apache was completely different from anything he had experienced as a cowboy. The Apache moved through the mountains with incredible skill and speed. They knew every path, every water source, and every place where they could hide from pursuing soldiers. Jack watched and learned from the warriors around him, trying to move as quietly and efficiently as they did. He learned to ride for hours without complaining, to survive on small amounts of food and water, and to stay alert for danger at all times. The young Apache warriors began to teach him their tracking skills, showing him how to read the ground and understand the movements of animals and people. During the day, Geronimo's band would hide in the mountains, staying out of sight of the soldiers who searched the valleys below. At night, they would move carefully through the darkness, making camp in hidden locations where fires could not be seen from a distance. Jack participated in every aspect of camp life. He helped hunt for food, gathered firewood, and stood watch at night to make sure no soldiers snuck up on the camp. The other warriors watched him work, and gradually, their suspicion began to turn into acceptance. Huera was always nearby, and she became Jack's guide through the world of Apache culture and survival. She showed him which plants could be eaten and which could be used for medicine. She taught him Apache words and explained the importance of Apache traditions and beliefs. She helped him understand the complicated history of why the Apache were fighting and what they were fighting for. With Huera by his side, Jack could navigate the complex social world of the Apache camp. He understood that without her protection and guidance, many of the warriors would have rejected him completely. As weeks turned into months, something remarkable began to happen. Some of the Apache warriors started calling Jack by an Apache name. It was not his real name, but a name that recognized he had crossed an invisible boundary between the white world and the Apache world. He was no longer just a white cowboy living among the Apache. He was becoming part of the community, part of the band, part of the fight for freedom. Young Apache children who had been born on the run, who had never known peace or safety, began to trust him and learn from him. Jack learned the skills of Apache warfare and survival that would have taken an Apache warrior years to perfect. He learned how to fight using the terrain as a weapon, how to move through the desert without leaving tracks, and how to survive on almost nothing when food was scarce. He became strong in ways he had never been before. His body hardened by the harsh conditions and constant movement. His mind became sharper too, constantly alert, constantly thinking about survival and strategy. Geronimo himself began to notice Jack more as time passed. The great warrior, who had lost multiple wives and children to violence and warfare, came to accept Jack's presence in a way that seemed impossible at first. Geronimo understood that this cowboy had given up everything from his old life to follow Huera and the Apache into the mountains. He recognized that Jack was willing to die fighting alongside them, and that kind of commitment was something Geronimo could respect. Jack and Huera's relationship deepened during this time. They shared a tent, a life, and the constant danger of their situation at night. They talked about their dreams and their fears, about the possibility that they might never see peace again, about what they would do if the soldiers finally caught them. Huera told Jack stories about her childhood before the wars, about the beautiful lands the Apache had lost, about the way life used to be when the Apache were free. Jack listened and learned and loved this remarkable woman who had survived so much and still carried hope in her heart. The historical records that later historians found suggested that some of Geronimo's daughters had married white men, and these men came to be known as white Apache because they had chosen to live with the Apache instead of with their own people. Jack Morrison's story followed a similar path, though the full details of his life with the Apache were never completely recorded in official documents. He was a white man who had crossed cultural boundaries during a time when such crossing was considered shameful and impossible. But Jack had chosen to live between two worlds, and he paid the price for that choice every single day. For over a year, Jack lived this impossible life. Moving through the Sierra Madre Mountains with Geronimo's band, he became a skilled warrior, a trusted member of the community, and a devoted partner to Huera. He experienced freedom in the mountains, but it was a freedom that came with constant danger, and the knowledge that soldiers were always searching for them. Jack Morrison had entered the Apache world as a stranger and an outsider, but through courage, respect, and genuine love for Huera and her people, he had become something entirely new. By September 1886, after more than a year of constant pursuit, Geronimo and his band of Apache were exhausted. American soldiers commanded by General Nelson Miles and Captain Henry Lawton had chased them relentlessly through the mountains and deserts of Mexico and Arizona. The Apache had little time to rest, little food to eat, and no chance to escape the constant pressure of the American military. What had once seemed like a glorious escape into freedom had become a desperate struggle for survival. Even the strongest warriors were worn down by months and months of running and fighting. Geronimo understood that his people could not continue this way forever. He knew that children were suffering, that women were exhausted, and that the warriors were running out of strength and ammunition. He made the painful decision that he had never wanted to make. the decision to surrender. It was not a decision made from cowardice or weakness, but from a leader's responsibility to protect his people from complete destruction. On September 4, 1886, Geronimo walked into Skeleton Canyon in Arizona and surrendered his rifle to General Miles. With him were approximately 30 to 40 warriors and about 100 women and children. The great Apache leader who had resisted the Mexican and American armies for so many years finally accepted defeat. The longest and most expensive counterinsurgency campaign in American military history had come to an end. But the surrender was not the end of the story. The Apache were not set free or allowed to return to their lands. Instead, Geronimo and his followers were immediately put into railroad cars and transported hundreds of miles away from their homeland. First, they were taken to Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, a place completely foreign to desert-dwelling Apache. Many Apache died from disease, from the shock of the cold weather, and from the pain of being separated from their home. Jack Morrison and Huera were among those transported to Fort Marion. For the first time in over a year, they were no longer constantly moving, constantly hiding, constantly fighting for survival. But the new captivity was different from anything they had experienced before. They were prisoners in a distant place, far from the mountains and deserts they loved. Jack watched as Huera continued to be a source of strength for the other Apache women and children, helping them cope with this new tragedy. After several years at Fort Marion, the Apache were moved again, this time to Alabama. Then eventually they were transferred to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, which became their permanent home for many years. Huera worked with other Apache women to help her people adapt to this new environment. She used her knowledge of healing and teaching to help young people survive the trauma of their captivity and displacement. She remained a respected figure among her people. Even though she was no longer free to move where she wished, Huera lived at Fort Sill for the rest of her life, working as a healer and an interpreter for her people. She was one of the bravest Apache women who ever lived, and she carried her scars with dignity until her death around 1901 or 1902. She was buried in the Beef Creek Apache Cemetery at Fort Sill, alongside the remains of Apache warriors and family members. When Geronimo died in 1909, also at Fort Sill, after being thrown from his horse and developing pneumonia, Huera had already passed away. But her legacy of courage and survival lived on through the stories the Apache people told about her. Jack Morrison's story faded into the past. Some historical records mentioned that Geronimo had a daughter who married a white man called Zabina Streeter, a man the Apache sometimes called White Apache. But official documents did not always record the complete details of such relationships. Jack Morrison's name appeared in few records, and many people forgot about the white cowboy who had chosen to live among the Apache. But among the Apache people themselves, the story survived in oral tradition. The legend that had said no white man could survive meeting the Apache Queen was proven wrong by a cowboy who not only survived, but who chose to love and stay with her. Jack and Huera's relationship existed in a time when such relationships were considered wrong and shameful by both Apache and white society. Yet they had created something beautiful and real in the middle of terrible circumstances. Geronimo became a prisoner of war, spending the rest of his life at Fort Sill, never allowed to return to Arizona. In his final years, he reportedly expressed regret that he had surrendered, saying he should have fought until death. But his surrender had saved many lives, particularly the lives of women and children, who could not have survived much longer on the run. The Apache Wars had ended, but the struggle of the Apache people continued in different forms. They were no longer free to roam their traditional lands, but they survived as a people, maintaining their culture and traditions even in captivity. Huera had said, "I have spoken," and her words had changed history. The speech that inspired the Great Escape in 1885 became legendary among the Apache, a moment when one brave woman's words ignited an entire nation's determination to fight for freedom. Jack Morrison and Huera proved that connection between people could transcend the boundaries that separated two worlds at war. Their story was a story of survival, courage, and the transformative power of love between two people who should have been enemies, but chose instead to be allies and partners.